I want to thank Matthew Raskoff, Vice Provost for Digital Education at Stanford University, my collaborator in this series. He will close out our program tonight. Tonight's event is one of a series of 10 nationally syndicated author conversations that we're conducting over Zoom. Each event is featuring a prominent author of a new book in the field, as well as an expert colleague in conversation with them about their work. For a full list of participating authors and interviewers, please visit our event calendar. There'll be a link dropped in the Zoom chat. We have a terrific lineup of speakers, and registration is free and open to the public. These talks are syndicated nationwide by our institutional co-sponsors, who are listed on the slide you see here. We are pleased to add Johns Hopkins University, North Dakota State University, and Northwestern University just this past week. If your institution is not represented on this list and you would like to become a co-sponsor, please do let us know. There's no cost to co-sponsor. You simply put the events on your local events calendars and newsletters, and then we will include you and your institution on the list. And with that, I am pleased to introduce Sekile Nzinga, president of the Nzinga Collective and former interim chief diversity officer and associate provost of diversity and inclusion at Northwestern University. Her recent book, Lean Semesters: How Higher Education Reproduces Inequity, addresses in depth the reality that women of color, particularly Black women, face compounded exploitation and economic inequality within our universities. She will be interviewed tonight by Natasha Warikoo, professor of sociology at Tufts University. Thank you both for joining us tonight, Sekile and Natasha. It's good to see you both here. I am very grateful to you for being part of the series. And before I turn the floor over to Natasha, I want to briefly outline the format of tonight's program. So this conversation is part of an ongoing dialogue, and as such, we will be leaving the Zoom chat room open for comments and questions. We will be monitoring the chat for instances of inappropriate or disruptive language, and if necessary, we will remove users from the event. Following the conclusion of tonight's author conversation, we will open the floor to audience questions. If you would like to submit a question during the event, please use the Zoom Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Again, thank you all for joining us, and Natasha, please take it away.
Thank you so much for this invitation and this opportunity to be in conversation with Sekile Nzinga about this really marvelous and important book. So I'm going to say just a few quick words about the book, and then I'm going to ask Sekile a few questions to have her just engage in a conversation between the two of us, and then we're going to, in about 30 minutes, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience, and we'll take them through the Q&A. So you can drop your questions at any point in there, and I'll see them in about 30 minutes. So let me just say a little bit about this book, Lean Semesters. Here it is. I don't know if that's on the right. How Higher Education Reproduces Inequality. This book is about Black women faculty in higher education and the precarity of their work as they join the academy at a time of decreased stability and funding for teaching in higher education. So just as the number of Black women with PhDs is increasing, state funding, full-time positions seem to be decreasing. And so they're in this entering higher education in this moment in which contingency is much more the norm than it was in the past. So she interviews three groups of Black women graduate students, contingent faculty, and then academic caregivers. And she shows the way that universities are organized, that the ways the universities are organized place these women in precarious, economically vulnerable positions. So it's sort of this economic precarity is really built into the structure of these universities as she describes it. I really appreciate how she foregrounds the voices of the women in her analyses. We were talking just before we went live about how, you know, her kind of commitment to the women in that she spoke with and telling their story in a way that's empathetic and honest is really comes through in this book. She describes how student debt and economic precarity, even once they finish the PhD and are teaching, as well as tensions between mothering and teaching, make particular demands on Black women. The conditions of this work, has seen a kind of rapid decline. And so I really appreciate this book because I think, there's just not nearly enough attention to this sector of higher education. I'm guilty of that. I wrote a book about elite higher education. And I think we need to be paying a lot more attention to the kinds of places that the women she interviewed, most of the women that she interviewed are studying and teaching at. I think there's not nearly enough attention to the sector. And I think there's a growing, I see this book in conversation with, some books that are starting to come out that are looking at the sector. I think of Tressie McMillan Cotton's Lower Ed. She calls this sort of private higher ed sector lower ed. And I kind of imagined some of the women who were teaching in for-profit institutions as, parallel to some of the story that she talks about in that book. Another book, Broke, by Laura Hamilton and Kelly Nielsen, also talks about the way that just as the number of, they're talking about students, as the number of students of color are increasing in higher education, state funding is rapidly decreasing. And so these universities are state-funded universities are having to do so much more with so much less. And it's affecting the student experience, particularly for low-income Black, Latinx students that they study. And so I really see this book as in conversation with these kinds of stories. And I think it's an important piece to this to the conversation. In the women's words, they're so powerful in this book, and their sort of devotion to education and the desire to be a part of, be teaching in higher education, be doing research, and the kind of conflicts and struggles that go along with that. I heard strong echoes of what Grubb and Lauzon call the kind of education gospel, this idea that problems in society can be solved through schooling. Despite a mismatch between education and jobs. And so are kind of heartbreaking stories of women trying to achieve particular goals that should be available to them, but having to sacrifice so much and to live with not a lot of economic security as they do so. So I really appreciate you telling their story and telling it in such an empathetic and caring way. So I'm going to just ask you a few questions just to kind of engage in conversation about, just to hear a little bit more about, how you came to write this book and what you found. So I thought I'd just start out by asking you what led you to write this book.
Thank you so much. Natasha, and for that wonderful framing and reminding me of what I wrote, right? It's like we just keep going and going, and sometimes we forget. And so I just appreciate the work. I wanted to start quickly before I answered your question, and first just offer my deep gratitude to the series organizers for keeping me in community as a scholar who's no longer in higher ed. And I get a bit homesick sometimes. I miss the Women's Center at Northwestern so much. And the pandemic has actually given this book's publication a different life's course. So I'm really grateful to be in conversation this evening with my fellow comrades who are committed to reclaiming higher ed as a public good. I also want to quickly say that my thoughts and ideas shared here tonight and within my book are my own, and that I'm not here in my role as a Chief Equity Officer of the state of Illinois and within the Office of the Governor. So with those pieces out of the way, on to the first question. So how I came to write this book. In 2013, I published an edited volume entitled Laboring Positions, Black Women Mothering in the Academy. I was on a feminist Canadian academic feminist press, Demeter Press. And that book focused on a few kind of broad categories: the imposition of maternalized labor that many Black women navigate in higher ed, racialized academic experiences of labor in particular was what the focus, that one theme came out of it. Another theme in that book was around the complexity of work life that Black women were experiencing as academic mothers. And the third piece really featured some studies that were grounded in Black feminist and maternal theory and reproductive justice. And so these collaborations and my collaborators offered some really unique contributions to maternal studies, but two chapters in particular haunted me well after the publication of that volume. And those chapters focused on testimonies of an intersectional analysis of these two precariously employed Black women scholars who were mothers, they were graduate students, and they were adjunct faculty members at two different institutions, two different, chapters, but their stories were really profound. And I was haunted as a tenured faculty member as I kind of grappled with the content of those chapters. And so they really, I think what was hard to hear and what I struggled with was that those chapters had themes of economic struggle, of defiance against a cloister system that didn't honor their brilliance, ambivalence towards the academic labor movement, and solidarity with their students often who were also struggling. You talked about the book Broke. They wrote about this kind of solidarity they had with their students, and really thinking about intellectual life beyond the academy, not wanting to be framed as a victim. These weren't victim narratives, but narratives. They were truth telling, And so, as a former social worker with a working class background, I found myself really deeply disturbed by the reality that many the kind of material and economic conditions and reality that seem to mirror my former clients who we told, hey, go to college, get an education, it will better your life. And so here I had these colleagues who had done all those things, but their reality looked almost identical in some ways to the people I had, naively in my 20s encouraged to go on to college. And so I was really curious and deeply, like I said, haunted by that paradox of economic struggle and advanced education that my contributors kind of unearthed in my first book. And it really demanded that I examine the current systems, the structures, the processes and practices of higher ed, and those, and as well as those within U.S. social policy that were reproducing and compounding inequality for Black women in the neoliberal era, and Black women academics in particular. So that's kind of, it really was like, it was born out of the first volume. I couldn't just move on, and I couldn't just kind of, I needed to go on an archaeological dig, and I needed to start right where I was, which was in higher ed. And so that's kind of how that book came to be. That was the launch. How I finished the book, which is what I alluded to earlier, was because I had left my faculty role at U.S.A, but I could not leave these narratives behind. And so why I started the book and why I finished the book were two different things. I finished the book because of my deep solidarity and commitment. I see this work as a scholar, of course, an academic, research project, but it also is an act of witnessing project, and it's a solidarity project. And so it's a solidarity project with the folks who I started this journey with. So thanks for asking.
So I was just going to say that kind of sense of solidarity really comes through in the writing, and so I feel that very strongly. And I think this sort of exploding of this ideology of equal opportunity and education as a sort of pathway to social mobility is just, it becomes so clear in this book how it's sort of like this myth that we sort of are fed, I think, in the United States, and in such a problematic way.
Yeah.
I would love to hear you talk about, what you think needs to happen, either in open access colleges where most of the women were teaching, or, whether it's at those colleges or in state policies or federal policies to address some of the issues you raise in this book related to higher education. What's the sort of, what's the next step?
Good
Get a
question.
magic wand.
Yeah, a good question. I feel like I need a couple of hours to answer it, but I have 4 things that I was like, all right, what will I think about? So I'm going to be a millennial and say #cancel student loan debt, right? so that is I'm going to beat that drum until it happens, and not in these very conditional ways, not $10,000, not $50,000, not this group and not that group, but really it is we're at 1.8 to 1.9 trillion. When I started the book, by the way, we were at 1.2 trillion in student loan debt, and it had surpassed our consumer debt. So I would argue that canceling student loan debt is, as you saw, my chapter 1 is called Mortgaging Our Brains. A theme that came out of those interviews was folks feeling like they had, they had to you know, literally their PhD was higher than their housing, you know, payments. And so canceling student loan debt, I think, is a significant piece of intervention at the federal level. And that's for everyone, not for folks who meet these certain conditions, because it was kind of my generation of folks that began to really, you know, those of us who went to school in the late 90s and the early aughts, like that's really when you begin to see the predatory practices of financial institutions. And as we know, the bubble burst on housing, this is where, you know, these financial institutions turn and prey upon students. And so I really need, you know, us to be protected. So that's one piece, is to cancel student loan debt, and connected to canceling student loan debt is to, of course, make college truly accessible. Outside of higher ed, I do work in abortion access and reproductive justice. And I like to talk about accessibility of these two kinds of things. We say that abortion is accessible. Yes, we have a very threatened right to abortion, but you can't access abortion unless you can afford it. And I think the same kind of analysis you can use for education. Yes, everyone has a right to education technically in the U.S., but who cares about that right if you don't have access, if you can't afford it? And so I am a strong proponent of free higher ed, and I think that making college accessible is one, you know, significant intervention. And so yes, these are magic wand wishes, but these are things that I believe we should be mobilizing around. If we say that education is a common good, if we say that education is what will advance us as a society together, right? And so so that's two pieces. To not, just because you wanted to learn more, you should not be saddled with debt for the rest of your life, right? And so I really think that that's one piece. Another piece, and I think those pieces work together. My chapter 3 really engaged, it went beyond the college campus policy to look at U.S. social policy, particularly that's supposed to be supporting parents. And so I really interrogated TANF and the ways in which TANF penalizes parents seeking education. And so as you saw in chapter 3, folks who needed to be working on their PhD and needed to get, public assistance or SNAP food benefits, they would lose those things if they got a summer grant to work on their scholarships, right? Because of the way that the policy is written. Or you couldn't work too many, you couldn't, if you wanted to work on your PhD and you needed childcare, you had to go to the job training program, right? So that these kinds of, stipulations and punitive policies are those that I would remove. Restrictions, that you should not be penalized because you're getting a PhD. So those penalized because you're getting a bachelor's degree, penalized because you're getting an associate's degree, that should not be tied to the supports you need as a parent. And so that's one piece, is that I would really interrogate and disentangle the TANF, restrictions, which became more and more articulated, really, quite honestly, in the 80s and 90s. So the last thing, and I'll stop there and go back on campus, is to say that I think that we need to halt with these capital projects and fancy dorms and put that freaking money back in the students and back in faculty salaries. And so back at childcare and all the other things we need so that folks can actually go to college or be a professor and thrive, and be a staff member and thrive. And so I know that's a mouthful, but I do have thoughts on all these interventions. And so I'll stop there.
So, I mean, I think that the data in the book really makes a compelling case for, I think, all four of those. It becomes very clear how we need to incorporate higher education and access to higher education into our social safety net. So as we think about the safety net, we can't stop at K-12. It's very clear that higher ed needs to be a part of that, given the role that it plays. And the capital projects is interesting. I often think, especially for private elite colleges, and I know you were at Northwestern most recently. I always think like, well, how do we get away with like not like sharing some of that wealth, and not
So I'm
putting
big,
a percentage of those donations to lower ed.
yeah, when I got in front of our alumni, I said, make a commitment to the people who came after you, not, and it's not in buildings. It's not in a bench. We don't need more benches on campus. We don't need a lazy river. We don't need a lazy river on campus. We need students not in their cars holding their jaws because they're choosing between food and books, which is what some of the folks were experiencing that I've worked with, not necessarily in this book, but in my experience as an academic administrator. So those are the things we need. We need students to have dental care when they're right. So those are the pieces, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So I'd love to hear you talk about how you see, I know you haven't done follow-up interviews, but just how do you see the situation changing for, say, the particular women that you interviewed or women in those positions, given the impact of COVID-19 particularly on the kinds of colleges that they were teaching at, in terms of declining enrollment. I worry about contingent faculty losing their positions, and their own, even when they had their economic precarity, even when they had positions pre-COVID when you were interviewing them.
Yeah. So one of the key arguments that I make is that that what I'm saying here actually maps onto everyone, right? So I'm looking at some of the most marginalized folks who are contingent, folks who are graduate students and not funded, folks who are parenting. So they're, of course, the margins of the margins in many cases, right? So many of them are queer, right? So they're the margins of the margins. But this is actually true for all of us. And so what I would say is that across identities and experiences and ranks, that everyone, and we all know this is what this series is about, is really we are experiencing even more harm happening during COVID, and more from a neoliberal perspective, a justification for belt tightening now. So now, before it was, a little bit more opaque and, and brazen, but now we can justify all the things that we're doing and say it's because of COVID, right? But I know I belong to an institution that ended up having an $83 million surplus after COVID, that first year of COVID, because of their belt tightening. And so there's a way in which we have to begin to ask, is this really about stabilizing the university, or are you justifying, wealth, more wealth attainment? So I would say that the conditions are worsening for everyone, and it's scary because you're seeing the justification now being, oh, it's COVID, and that's why we're doing this, right? We're not being bad guys, it's COVID. And so throughout the pandemic, I would say that it was really hard to kind of bear witness to the conditions of faculty and students worsening. But a lost chapter of my book and a missed opportunity for me, where I failed to really acknowledge that the people who I saw struggling the most in higher ed were actually academic staff, which represent the vast majority of the workers on campus, and where you will actually see more people of color, particularly Black women. And so they are more vulnerable. They were the folks who were laid off. They were the folks who were furloughed. They were the folks who were expected to come back to campus, so that students who were eager to come back to campus before it was safe could have activities to do and the campus could look normal. Meanwhile, administrators and faculty were able to stay home in most cases. So, and I know I'm not talking about the staff who, of course, are like essential staff. I'm saying all of a sudden the folks in multicultural student affairs, the student-facing, staff, women's centers, diversity centers, those folks who belong to marginalized, spaces in many ways have heightened risk for COVID, are now pushed back to campus, right? Because the campus needs to look normal and look active. Business needs to look like it's going on with regularity. And so those folks are especially vulnerable, and they're not often in academic labor movement conversations that faculty are engaged in. And they're not always involved even in the student, protests that are happening on campus. But the most vulnerable population and the most populous population of workers and folks on campus with disproportionate amounts of people of color and Black people and Black women are our academic staff. So I think they need to be prioritized in this discussion. The last piece that I will say is that many Black women with PhDs, those who are in this study, they actually often ended up being academic staff because they weren't good enough to be a faculty member, but they were good enough to be a multicultural student affairs, director, right? So they're often over educated and over qualified to hold many of the roles they held on campus, and they were again underpaid. So another form of how income is suppressed. So I think that. That's an important piece to just kind of name when we think about what precarity is looking like and where to look for it. It's in the faculty, it's in the students, but it's particularly in academic staff.
Yeah, that's a really good point that you make, because we often think of we know that the kind of administrative staff in universities is growing, and I think when people, at least I think often in my imagination, that's very high paid provosts and deans, and there are those positions, but there's so many more and growing numbers of positions that are those kind of lower paid, lower ranked kind of positions that and we don't pay enough, and they're kind of often the kind of heart of the university, right, where they're catering to the needs often, particularly for marginalized students, to make them feel connected to the university, to ensure their success.
And I write about this, and I think if you have a commitment to students and you are a mentor to students and this is part of your work, I think it is okay for you to say, this is my commitment. But when that's an imposition, right? When I actually call that academic mammying. When you're responsible for taking up the universities, I write about this as academic mammying, the responsibility to take care of the university's children, when you not having agency around that, right? So it's not to disempower folks and say all of that is imposed. I want to name that we do have agency, but I want to say that it is traditionally imposed that this is your job, right? Yeah. And they are frontline workers of the university, but and that means you can be working in the cafeteria, but you're looking after students, and you saw a lot of the activism at Northwestern with students trying to help those staff when they lost their jobs, and so they were trying to they did so much fundraising and around trying to help folks pay their bills and take care of their children. And a lot of those workers were workers of color. And so I think it's important to name that, in this work around, the common, what it means to have a public good is to make sure we do not forget our staff. One provost that I work with would always say, faculty and students are the heartbeat of the university. And I would follow her before she could finish her sentence and say, yes, but your staff are your backbone, and we need to prioritize staff in this university. So I think it's really critical.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think even among the faculty that you interview in this book, it's clear so many of them are playing this kind of role, I think, in there as Black women, mentoring their students, taking care of their students as well, right? And I think part of that is their lived experience, that shared experience with many of their students. That's different for other faculty, I think.
Yeah.
And
to not have that, like, okay, I think it's fine if we mentor students, but can we have that count towards tenure and promotion?
Yeah.
Have that be visible, be legible, have meaning around it. And of course, as you move into research ones and elite universities, those kinds of practices are not acknowledged and are not seen.
Yep, absolutely. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your role as Chief Equity Officer in the state of Illinois, and how you see, what your vision is for, as you think about higher education in the state of Illinois. And, imagining again some of the women that you interviewed, or just, as you think about the role of higher education as a public good,
So I'm going to tiptoe into this one and figure out how I can answer it. What I will say is, what I bring into my role is decades of being a social work professor, a women's studies professor, and an academic administrator, and someone who's worked in the reproductive justice movement and in education and health and policy. So I bring all of that into this work. That gives me a particular perspective on how I approach leadership. I tend to be intentional and collaborative, and I tend to move I tend to move in a way that's not reactive, but responsive. So I'll talk more about my approach to the work, which government moves very fast and also very slow. And, you know, and so I think what I'm hoping is to be is an intervention in how we can, from a governor's office, be an influencer on policy and legislation, but also be really intimately connected to and build capacity within state government through the work with our agencies. And so I bring my feminist perspective, my collaborative approach, my engaged style of leadership, my engaged style of scholarship, quite honestly, my way in which I think intellectual life should be accessible. I bring that to my role. And what I've heard from folks is that, you know, it was weird when I got here because folks just said, thank you for coming here. They said academics are so high up and so far away, and they critique folks for not knowing. And what they said was, thank you for coming and you know, being with us and being an educator within this space. And so, so I think, I'll just kind of use that as a framing to say that made me feel welcomed, and it made me as an academic just think about where else we can show up and how we can show up in a way that's not pretentious and and not judgmental, but really recognize that folks do want often to you know, support with thinking through a lot of these complex concepts that we articulate in our work, and help them actually digest that, or help folks give folks a language for their experience. I spent a lot of time just doing sessions just on one concept and giving folks that concept so that they can take in a half hour and then apply it to their work. And so that piece of thinking of how to be an intellectual that's accessible, and how to be yeah, and also how to be behind the scenes. Like I'm rarely on camera anymore. I'm rarely on the mic because that's not kind of my approach to this work. I'm not, it's not important for me to be out front, but it really is important for me to support folks within our state agencies who are doing the work. And so, and who or need direction on how to do the work and are overwhelmed trying to figure out what that direction is. So, so I think I'm going to kind of tiptoe around that answer by just framing how I approach the work, so that I don't kind of move in the area of sounding like I'm representing the governor's office in this moment.
Fair enough. Well, I'm super excited to see what you do, knowing how you know, getting a little insight into how you think from this book and this conversation. And I'm gonna, yeah, so I really am excited to see the impact that you're gonna have. I know that you'll have in the state of Illinois. So what I thought I'll do now is I'll turn to the Q&A, and folks, I can see that there's a bunch of stuff in the chat. I'm going to keep my eye on the Q&A just because it's easier for me to look at one thing. So if you have a question, if you put it in the chat, if you could go ahead and click that Q&A button and write it in the chat and in that section, then I'll take a look at it and I'll just take them in the order that they appear. So, okay, so I'm going to start with the first question, which is from Vishal Thapa. They ask, what are some of the actions that any university can take to mitigate the issues you've raised in this book?
Good question. So I think any institution can do a budget review and look at how you are spending, align your stated mission and commitments and goals and values of the university with your budget. And so if you say that you are committed to students, if you say you're committed to the intellectual life of faculty, if you say you're, you know, if you're using any language around diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice, and accessibility, you know, which people love to use those terms. I believe that we hold people's feet to the fire by really looking at where our dollars going, where to align our stated commitments with our budget. And so that's one piece. It's very hard. I can testify. It's very hard, but I think that that is where you can hold yourselves and your institution accountable. I think one of the things that we can begin to do also is really encourage, and I saw student activists do this in the university that I was part of, to ask for the budget, to ask for the budget to be public so that you can have access to how budgets are being, how funds are being appropriated. And so wealth can be redistributed. And so if you're at a private university, how do we on campus redistribute wealth? If you're in a public university, of course, then that requires us to think about who we put in leadership roles and how we think about laws and policies. If you look at some of our state systems, they're not public institutions anymore, quite honestly. They're receiving with less than 20 and 30% of public funding. It's all coming from contracts and private entities and so I think in the military, of course, and prisons. And so I think holding our universities accountable to how they redistribute their budgets, but then also who they are in relationship with that actually counters what they say they're committed to. Right. And there's lots of activity happening around the university. So I think that's one big one is to start with follow the money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And, it's funny because you talk about the budget following the mission, because I write a little bit about admissions. And this is what I've been saying. I also think about that with admissions. Like, it's the way that we admit students aligned with what our mission is as a university. And sometimes I've sort of said, well, maybe like if our mission is about, expanding opportunity, we shouldn't be trying to, we should like flip the way we think about like academic preparation, and just sort of really opening up this idea of like, what does it mean to select students and how is that furthering the goals that we're trying to achieve here?
In my work, both in and outside of education, when I work with leaders in the not-for-profit sector, I start with their mission. It's like, your mission says this.
Yeah.
Show me how that is being articulated. And so that is where, and it's not in a judgment space, it's in a curiosity space. Tell me, be curious, and of course we have to use techniques that are non-threatening, right? Because I am still a Black woman, right? So I enter from a place of curiosity. I'm curious to know how what you're spending your resources on is aligned with, what you said your mission and priorities were. They're not aligned. And so let's think about what that should look like.
Yeah. No, I think that's so important. So we have another question here from Cynthia Martz, Cynthia asks, do you believe the pandemic and resulting recession could finally force change for the most vulnerable populations in higher ed?
I think it's an opportunity for universities to respond. I think some universities are reimagining how they might be serving their student population. I think the pandemic really, I just watched when it was time for students to go, in March 2020, when they had to leave the campuses, and some students couldn't afford to come back to get their things, and so the university realized like, oh, wow, some of my students don't have wealth. We've got to figure out how to get them their stuff or start storage. So it was these kind of accidental learnings that we've been trying to tell you, but then these moments happen and you're like, oh, people don't have access to, people who live in rural communities and in working class and poor don't have access to Zoom or technological advances, so they can't turn their camera on. How I shouldn't be holding them accountable for that, right? And so I think that it's an opportunity for folks to really learn, apply what they learned, right? Because they can choose to have seen what happened over the last 2 years and develop a strategic way of thinking about how to build your university differently, or you can decide that we're going to stay business as usual. So I don't know. I think I'm hoping it's an opportunity. And I'm hoping to learn, I've been gone for about a year. So I'm hoping when I go back on campuses that in some ways it has changed, but I don't know. It's an opportunity, and it would be really unfortunate if we missed this opportunity to take what we've learned over the last 2 years and apply it, because what exists was there before the pandemic. It just got the veil got pulled away. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a question from Christina Royster, and Christina asks, if you were creating a university of your dreams based on diversity, inclusion, and equity best practices, what would it look like in terms of academicians, students, staff, and other members of the university community?
Well, it would be free. Not have borders in the ways that I've seen universities become walled off from our community. Anyone who's taken a class with me knows I never stay on campus anyway. Our class is always out in the community. So that's the social worker in me. So I would say that classes would always be connected to what community issues and community needs are, and communities would be leading and shaping and influencing the curriculum of the university. So it would be, I think, much more collaborative and community serving from a curriculum perspective and a purpose perspective. For faculty, of course, I think that faculty and staff, because I don't know why people talk about them separately. They're all employees. They all go through the same freaking HR system. The employees of the university, I think that I would, of course, like them to have a thriving wage, but that's my wish for anyone, whether they work in a university setting or not. So that folks would have a thriving wage. So it would be accessible. It would meet the research, would be driving and have a social commitment and a social impact. And it would also be a place where people can thrive and not struggle. And they should be socially, I would argue, politically and economically in a better position than they were when they started in those, their trajectory within that setting.
Yeah. You were reminding me of, I don't know if you've seen this new book by Amaka Okechukwu about race and higher education. And it's kind of two pieces. She talks about the history of activism around affirmative action, but then also open access. And I feel like this was like sort of a movement, in the 1970s to sort of open up universities, make them open access, but also be really linked to local communities and integrate, not be like the city on a hill, be a place where learning goes, like you said, borderless, kind of wall-less communities. And I found that really striking, how that's been just, that vision has been open access was lost, right? Even in the CUNY system where it was the biggest. And, and also I think these ties to local community. I remember when, I went to Brown and there was this Annenberg Institute that was so tied to the Providence community, and they just overhauled it and made it a kind of separate center with and kind of eliminated all of that great work that they were doing in Providence. And it's just kind of heartbreaking. And I think we need to come back to that.
I'm from Providence, and every Saturday when I was a kid, a red, black, and green school bus from Brown University's Black student organization would come pick me up, take me to campus, and I would spend the whole day having kind of like what people used to call Saturday school, and go back. And so I'm sure that influenced a lot of my thinking about this work. But again, that was students knowing that you should walls, right? And so students have brilliant ideas, and I think that they need to be elevated often. You can look to the students and the staff for what the university should be doing, and the community, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's see where I answered that. Okay, so here's a question from Belinda Wilkerson. She asked, what are some actions that could be taken to assist and inform students prior to entering higher education?
Around financial, I just want to make sure I went and that can go in different directions.
She doesn't say, and unfortunately, we can't get audience members to jump in. So I think,
good question. I think
on this. Yeah, go ahead.
I think we can be curious about what is it that they want to contribute to the world? What is it that they want to do? And we can give guidance around what the possibilities are. We can not glorify the four-year college. Actually seen a lot of, finally, a lot of, campaigns, online campaigns about this, but the ways in which we've glorified a four-year college is really at this point a marketing scheme, so I think it's really important for us to ask why are we encouraging someone to be part of these academic corporations, right? And so and be curious about what other options and destigmatize like not going to college, but really what is it that you want to contribute to society and how might I support you on that journey? And if it is college, then we can think about like also moving away from this notion that you have to go to a particular kind of college. My long-term partner and I have said this all the time. We both went to HBCUs. We went to state universities for a master's program, went to state universities for our PhD program. Both of our careers are finance, but it was hard because our kids were getting fed messages about the ranking of their school and this and that. And so trying to tell them like, you don't have to listen to that. That's just the marketing. But it was really hard because they're in this middle class community and it was so competitive, and you take pictures and you wear a sweatshirt and, you went to this college and you get this shiny, glossy thing, even though the school also has a green campus campaign, but then they're sending you hundreds of pamphlets from their university that completely contradicts their green campus campaign, and so it's so hard because kids are getting fed that. So even my three kids were, getting such hard mixed messages, and the message that floated to the top was the marketing message, not the rationale from their very established HBCU state university graduated parents, right? Yeah. So I think that really, I would say that it's really important to downplay the hype around the marketing hype around what kind of school. And there's a mathematician, I'm blanking on his name, but I know someone's going to drop it in the chat. There's a mathematician who just did a calculation of rankings across the country and actually said that the formula is flawed. And so the ways in which we rank universities is mathematically flawed. He's a top mathematician. Someone's going to drop in the chat because I know they read it too. But he completely has debunked this whole notion that rankings are real and but we believe them. So the answer for me is to help students expand their notion around what's next and to demystify, of course, the process and support them. If they do have that choice, they should be empowered to make the choices they want to make. But they also should know that notions around ranking and what's best and all, that you don't have to listen to that bullshit,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and this really aligns with like what a lot of the stuff that people in K-12 education talk about in terms of helping children kind of prepare for, their future and helping them imagine their future selves and not just sort of having this sort of college for all thing without a kind of clear kind of vision for what they want to be doing, which is what really matters. And I was also, when you talk about marketing, I remember in Tracy McGillan-Cotton's book, she talks about it was like an astonishing percentage of the budget of for-profit colleges goes into marketing. Like that's the way that they sort of, that's their kind of golden ticket.
That's true for private, elite, and not-for-profit and public institutions as well. Yeah. That a significant amount of money spent in marketing and as we know, an overrepresentation of people of color in those marketing materials. Yeah. And first book in my introduction, I talk about the way the commercials are also targeting. So they're not just marketing, they're targeting Black women in particular. There's an overrepresentation of Black women in those commercials as well. And so I do and offer an analysis of what that means. And what I say is they are marketing us against ourselves. And there's a lot of, if you look at the, I did an analysis of those commercials, and if you look at those content analysis, they use things like, oh, my professor's, she's so great, she's like a second mom to me, and or they use a lot of shaming, you're not doing anything anyway. It's a lot of racialized shaming. Get off the couch and come do something, go to college. And so really problematic and racist kind of messaging around why you should go to college. You're lazy, let's do something constructive, or go there and you can have this wonderful maternal figure. And that marketing us against ourselves is like a really, I don't know, it makes my skin crawl every time I see these commercials, because they are targeting. It's not just, they are targeting Black women and people, and Black people in particular. Yeah,
that's fascinating and kind of disturbing. I'm going to take a question from David Tatum, and David asks, what is the opportunity for innovations to address the economic inequality issues? Can we give faculty and staff more flexibility if we let them teach and work more online? Can we give students access to lower cost programs, or programs that allow them to mix work and study?
So I'm a big fan of flexible work. I think being trained as an academic, we do have some flexibility, but the pandemic has sharpened my analysis. Yes, I will answer that, David. I think there's an opportunity for innovation, and I love us reclaiming this term innovation. It kind of makes my skin crawl from from someone who doesn't like to use entrepreneurial business terms, but I can reclaim that. And I would say that if we are going to, for instance, not privatize the electricity that they're using, and the data that they're using, and the other resources that you need to set up a home office. So if we are going to actually make sure that the innovation should be in supporting someone to pay for that, because that's now funding, that's a savings when you're sending folks home. And nobody's talking about that we had to buy extra data plans and when everyone came home. No one's talking about that. All of that got privatized. All of those utilities got privatized. And so, and it's now on the backs of families. So it used to be that the tissues you brought to school, remember as a school supply list, it was the boxes of tissues and the sanitary, things that somehow got added along with the books and pencils, all of that work gets on the back of parents. Now the technological things you need are on the backs of parents. So what I'm suggesting is that, yes, we should think creatively about how to have these pieces that might lower the burden. But I think that we also need to recognize that it shouldn't fall on the backs of the folks at work or at school. So we need to outfit folks with that. Because I think if innovation only benefits the university pockets, then that's not innovation, but I do think there's an opportunity there.
Great, thank you. I'm going to see if I can consolidate these questions a little bit because we're almost out of time. I should have asked you this question earlier, but I'm going to ask you two questions at once that are sort of, I think, related. So Renee Hockaday asked, how did attending an HBCU for undergrad influence your approach to your work? Which is, you started to allude to, but I'd love to get the answer to that question as well. And Lourdes Andrade says, systemic racism, white supremacy, and other forms of oppression were built into the design of early institutions of higher education. And they reference Ebony and Ivy by Craig Stephen Wilder. And Lourdes goes on, some activists are critical of efforts to quote unquote transform rather than dismantle universities. What are your thoughts on where and how we should place efforts to affect change? So the influence of your undergraduate degree at an HBCU, and then, reform versus dismantle universities.
So I will try to take these on. I think that most folks who know me know that I'm a super fan of my HBCU experience. I've learned to say my HBCU experience because not everybody has the same experience within these institutions, and all institutions can produce forms of harm and neglect and missed opportunities. So for me, it was a really great experience for me to feel thriving after coming from Providence, which I had never even had a Black teacher in my life, but I think once, my fourth grade teacher, and that was the year I spent in North Carolina. So I've never had that experience. And so coming to an HBCU where my race difference was neutralized and people just had this expectation that I would thrive and that I would be successful, my professors. And I watched my professors also always be engaged beyond the university's borders, right? And so my mentor, Dr. Elmer Martin, he was the founder of the Blacks in Wax Museum in Baltimore. If you go to Baltimore, go to the Blacks in Wax Museum. And he had a community, after school program that ran out of the Blacks in Wax Museum that I was part of after class. And so watching my professors always, never be just on campus, definitely influenced me, and it made me want to become a professor. And it's that kind of engaged hands-on teaching that I brought with me to being a professor. What's interesting is I went to a small liberal arts school where, again, very student-centered teaching focus. These are valued, skill sets for faculty. But that my pedigree wasn't good enough to kind of get me into a Research One or an elite institution. And so this moves me to the second part of this question, was that as I'm in an elite space as an administrator, that what's valued are all the skills I gained from an HBCU experience and a small liberal arts experience. So I can't get a faculty role because for having these strong experiences around community engagement and really deep teaching. But you can be a staff person or an administrator in these systems that weren't built for us. And so this is where I agree that dismantling the ways in which academia values certain forms of knowledge and skill and competency, devalues the other forms is really problematic. So in a predominantly white setting, I don't shine in that environment. Someone who's focuses on students. I mean, I had deans explicitly tell me, focus on your book. Don't focus on teaching. So that's not the kind of educator that I want to be. So it was a values conflict for me when I went into white, university spaces where I was consistently told to downplay my way of engaging community, engaging students, doing really trying to innovate teaching kind of beyond the borders. So I do think that these systems aren't designed to honor and value the things that we bring, but at the same time, they are ours. And so the ways in which I refuse to not claim them as mine. So I live in Chicago now, and we have a strong, divide. It's one of the most segregated cities in the country. But I refuse for someone to tell me I can't go and take up space. And so my intention in higher ed is to say that we still belong, and to take up space and to take back space. And so I don't necessarily use reform as a framework, but I do use reclaim and taking back space that was denied to us, and that was ours in the first place. And so so that's my approach to kind of how I think about it. At the same time, I do think a lot of dismantling needs to happen. So I'm not, so it's not one where I feel like I'm upholding, but I'm being loud and brash and moving fuckers out the way. And so, and I'm really okay with that. And so, so taking up space is how I think about the work. Yeah.
So I feel like that's a perfect note to end on. And let me just say, I love that, this book is very critical, and, you pull no punches, and you have the same, today you've been very clear on the one hand. On the other hand, you give us a lot of just little examples of hope and, great practice and things that can be done and changed. And and I hope you move those fuckers out of the way in Illinois and do great work. And I'm so grateful for the work that you've done and for this conversation. So thank you so much. Everyone's loving it. Clean semester.
Natasha and Sekile, for an enlightening and eye-opening discussion this evening. I was struck by Sekile's model of how a scholar can translate her ideas into impact and activism and really bridge the gap between the worlds of policy and academia as a human being who's straddling both of those worlds. I also love the idea of reclaiming innovation, which I think our team is aspiring to do as well,
Yeah.
for the educational values of higher education in our community. For those interested in purchasing a copy of Lean Semesters, please visit the website of independent bookseller Book Culture. We'll put the link in the chat right now, and a limited number of signed copies will be available. I also encourage you to look for Natasha's upcoming book, Race at the Top, Asian Americans and Whites in Pursuit of the American Dream in Suburban Schools, which will be published by the University of Chicago Press in May. And we can put the link to that in the chat as well. We ask you to complete our post-event survey, which we'll put in the chat too. That'll help us improve these events. We're now planning season 2, and so we're looking for ideas for how we can structure this and how we can keep getting better. And last, I just wanted to invite everybody who's here to come to our next event in this series on Wednesday, April 27th, featuring Professor Emily Levine of Stanford University in conversation with Rick Levin, President Emeritus of Yale University and former CEO of Coursera. Emily's recent book, Allies and Rivals, examines the co-evolution of higher education in the United States and Germany during the 19th and 20th centuries. Thank you, everybody, for attending tonight. This was a marvelous conversation, third in our series, and we're so excited to continue with you. And thank you again, Natasha and Sekile, for hosting us tonight. Take care, everybody.